Antonio Vivaldi is probably one of the more famous of the Baroque composers, and certainly the one that you hear on Muzak in the stores the most frequently. Four Seasons you may well recognize just from hearing it playing in the background in any number of retail stores. Vivaldi was born in Venice, and he was born on the day of an earthquake. That's probably the reason that he was immediately baptized at his home by the midwife, rather than waiting the more typical several days, even up to a week, to be baptized at the church. So the deal was probably that his parents were just so scared spitless by this earthquake that they were like, baptize this kid and do it now. So he was baptized at home. His father was a barber, which at first seems like a very odd job for his father to have had for him to become a musician. But it actually makes a lot of sense because in that time, the barber shop was also a place of music making. I mean, think about it. You'd still have to wait around for the barber to get around to cutting your hair or doing your shave or whatever. So what are you going to do? It's not like you can flip through the latest issue of GQ or Cosmo or People or whatever, and there are no video games to play. So the barber would leave musical instruments scattered throughout the waiting room. And while you wait for your shave or your haircut, you just have a little jam session while you're sitting there. So music was definitely part of Antonio's life as a child. When he grew up, he took orders in the church, became a priest, and probably actually had been destined for the church since infancy, again, likely related to the fact that he was born in an earthquake and his parents were a little scared. He spent most of his career working at the Ospedale della Pietà, which was a orphanage for abandoned children, but specifically abandoned children of the nobility. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in just a second. He eventually got kicked out of the priesthood because I don't know, the church had this problem with the French soprano that he was living with, and they had a problem with the way he kept running out in the middle of celebrating mass because a fugue theme had popped into his head and he needed to get it written down. So he got kicked out of the church, and he had a hard time making ends meet for a while. He had actually gone to Vienna looking for work and died while he was there, pretty much a pauper at that point. Vivaldi is known as the father of the concerto, partly because he's the one who really established the final form of the concerto, the way we think of it today, but also the orchestration of the concerto and setting it up as, especially with the solo concerto, this idea of contrast, a contest between a large group and a small group or a soloist. The Ospedale della Pietà, this orphanage for offspring of the nobility. Now, they aren't really orphans, right? Venice had this problem in that there were so many illegitimate children being born and just abandoned that the city started these orphanages where the parents could bring this illegitimate child and know that it was going to be taken care of. But you didn't want anybody to know that because that could be pretty dangerous. So this is the Ospedale right here, and you just sail up in your gondola and you go actually back in this little alleyway right here, right? And go down this alley. Here's the baby door. So the ground level would have been quite a bit higher at that point. But what you do is you open this little door and you stick your baby in there. And you ring the bell. And a nun or a priest on the other side of this door opens the door, takes the baby out, and the baby is now admitted to the Ospedale della Pietà. And branded with this little tattoo so that it's always known that this child is from this orphanage. The Ospedale was not a horrible place to live because the parents of the children there would financially support the institution. So they were very comfortable, they were well educated, The boys, when they were somewhere around 12 years old, would get apprenticed out, and the girls tended to stay somewhat longer. So there were more girls. And this was where Vivaldi worked primarily. He was the director of the orchestra of all girls. This orchestra became so famous, so well known, it became a Sunday destination for people to come for these weekly concerts. But see, here's the deal. They're still girls, right? And this is not proper for girls. But they decided that it was okay as long as they were performing up behind this screen. So the screen up here is where they would perform in the church, and people would come to hear these concerts. It's even possible that the girls knew their parents, because after the concert, again behind a screen, you could go to a room in the church and actually talk with the girls. Now, the musical training that these girls received was so good, so well known, that after a while, girls who were legitimate could be paid students to go, so they could pay a tuition and go to the same school and be trained there. We know of one young woman, Anna Bonn, who did this, and she became a composer until she got married. Vivaldi wrote about 500 concertos. That's a lot. And standardized the orchestra for these concertos at about 20 to 25 strings that are divided up pretty much in the way that we would recognize a modern string orchestra. The only difference would be that the cellos and the string basses played the same music. They didn't have their own separate parts. A continuo would be part of this orchestra because, as we've seen in the Baroque era, there's this basso continuo, which is this group, a harpsichord or organ plus a sustaining instrument to play the bass line. And so that's why Baroque music has this very bottom-heavy feel to it. Sometimes there were flutes, oboes, bassoons, and horns, usually in pairs, as part of these concertos as well. And a lot of the concertos, because they were intended to be entertainment, right? They're being written for these Sunday afternoon concerts. There are a lot of effects that are just there, that are there for show or for color, to make it somewhat more interesting. The soloists for these concertos were not virtuosos who were brought in from Vienna or London or Paris. They were just the players from the sections in the orchestra. Vivaldi wrote about 350 concertos for one solo instrument, usually violin, but he also wrote solo concertos for bassoon, cello, oboe, flute, viola d'amore, recorder, and even mandolin. If you want to jump on YouTube and just search for Vivaldi mandolin concertos, they're really cool. The structure of these is the first movement is fast, the second movement is slow, the third movement is fast. In either the first or the last, maybe sometimes both, first and last, there's a cadenza. A cadenza is a section in which the orchestra drops out and it's just the solo instrument left playing, and it's all about the pyrotechnics. It's what really impressive virtuosic stuff can this soloist perform to just blow us away and amaze us. In this time period, those cadenzas were usually improvised. By the time of Beethoven-ish, the composers are starting to write the cadenzas out, but right now they would have been improvised just on the spot in the performance. A concerto grosso, on the other hand, is not a solo instrument, not just one solo instrument, it's a group of solo instruments. So you have the full orchestra, which is known as the ripieno. And then the concertino is the solo group, so maybe a violin and a flute and a trumpet. So you have a small group of solo instruments, and that's the group that plays the real virtuosic stuff. On the other hand, in the ripieno, it's just the more solid tonal stability. It's the material that comes back repeatedly. Vivaldi's main contributions to the concerto grosso are creating this real contrast between the ripieno and the concertino. So there, you definitely have the sense of that concertino group being a solo virtuosic group, but also the syntax of musical events. That is, their logical, compelling, and a commonly understood order of musical events. That is, the order of movements, fast, slow, fast. That's the way they were standardized through Vivaldi. And the tonal harmonic movement within each section, as well as the role of the soloist and the orchestra. The Four Seasons is a set of, surprise, surprise, four concertos for solo violin. So it's a solo concerto and it's programmatic. Program music is music that has some extra musical association to it. In this case, Vivaldi wrote a sonnet to go along with each concerto representing each of the four seasons. So the sonnet about spring is given to you here, one for each movement. Joyful spring has arrived, the birds greet it with their cheerful song, and the brooks and the gentle breezes flow with a sweet murmur. So the whole idea of the music then is to depict this sonnet. What you want to be thinking about maybe before you listen is, how would you depict spring? What are the things that you associate with spring? So cheerful bird song. What would that sound like in a violin and an orchestra? What would a gentle breeze sound like? Or the sweet murmur of a brook. On the other hand, how are you going to depict a storm? What you'll hear is that Vivaldi does this through these color effects that we mentioned before. So when it's imitating a bird, you're going to have lots of trilling and high notes in the violin. The thunderstorm is fantastic because you hear the thunder and tremolo, where you have the stringed instruments take their bows and they move back and forth really, really fast. And so you get this kind of thundering effect. And then for the lightning, you hear these very rapid shooting notes going up. They should sort of be coming down, shouldn't they? But they're going up, and it somehow sounds like lightning. What you want to do at this point now is, we're done with the video, so stop the video and go and listen to the Four Seasons recording and watch the YouTube clip of it.